Well, hello everyone. If you're watching this recording, it means one of two things. It means either our attempt to do this live from the build site failed, or perhaps you're just watching it after the fact, so you're watching the recording. But either way, I'm thrilled to have you interested enough to watch this, particularly as we mark National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. I was absolutely thrilled when Jennifer approached me to see if I'd talk about the recent Habitat for Humanity builds that a group of us have been doing on Indigenous territories in Canada these past few years. My only problem is, once I get started talking about this stuff, to actually get stopped. So hopefully I won't go on too long. I'll start with a little bit of history first because it's really important for context. For many, many years, I wanted to do a Habitat Global Village build overseas somewhere to help out some people in far off places that are obviously not as blessed as we are. It was one of those sort of bucket list objectives that I always thought I would get to someday. But a good friend of mine passed away suddenly and unexpectedly in 2014. And I said, to heck with waiting. I'm going to book a build now. So that's how I ended up on my first build overseas in 2015, a team that went to Daan Bantayan in the Philippines. That build was life-altering in more ways than I can possibly express here, but suffice to say that I was hooked. And I followed that first build with one in 2016 in New Delhi, India, and then 2017 in southeast Nepal. All spectacular builds working with our teams alongside the locals. I probably would have continued along with that path of doing annual overseas builds, but I decided to book my 2018 trip along with a family friend in memory of my dad, who was the proudest of proud Canadians. So we stayed in Canada and booked a build at Curve Lake First Nation in his memory. That build was hugely eye-opening. To see what was really third world conditions here in our own country. Our team leader on that build had been on the team in the Philippines and has led teams all over the world. And he took the opportunity to sort and distribute study materials before the trip, and then arranged time to spend with band leadership and with the eventual homeowners while we were on the build. All of that led us to understand the culture a wee bit more and empowered us to be part of the solution. We've all heard the word reconciliation bantered about, but educating yourself and then spending time on First Nations land with First Nations people brings it much more sharply into focus. In 2019, I joined the same Habitat team leaders on a build in Chippewas of Nawash First Nation, and it was just as eye-opening. It also introduced me to the well-run, well-equipped Habitat team in the Grey Bruce region and their Partnership of Hope program with the local First Nations, all of which are a big part of what keeps me going back to that particular region. After that 2019 build, of course, we had all plans put on hold for a while because of the pandemic. But then in June 2022, when things opened up again, I took a team of 8 for a day of building with the same Habitat group, but this time at Saugeen First Nation, the day before Indigenous Peoples Day. I should explain that a little bit. Because of this study that I've done and my interest, I always want to be there building in the days right around Indigenous Peoples Day. It just feels particularly appropriate to me to mark that day by helping out. In September 2022, I joined in with another team on Orange Shirt Day at Chippewas of Nawash Unceded First Nation. It's another awesome build experience. And then in June of this year, I led a team of 25 family, friends, former colleagues, and church folk on a 2-day build in Saugeen First Nation, again, just before Indigenous Peoples Day, which falls in June. Those builds on First Nations territory, together with our studies leading up to each build, have been profoundly eye-opening. One of the study resources I strongly recommend to anybody who's looking at joining a build on First Nations territory, or anybody in Canada for that matter, really, is an online 4 Seasons of Reconciliation course produced in collaboration with the First Nations University of Canada. A bunch of us in my church, even before we headed out on that first build, a bunch of the church folk took that through the Rutherford Foundation. And some of my teammates who were headed up to the build with me in June. Took that program specifically in preparation for the build. My friend and frequent Habitat team leader, Ken Rutherford, has coined a great phrase to summarize his approach to First Nations relationships on these builds. And it's the approach I try to adopt as well. He calls it the 3 E's of reconciliation. Those are empowerment, experience, and education. We all in Canada should start with education, of course, and there's a great deal of material out there if we just take the time to look at it. That should start, of course, with the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But there are also some great study resources like a book called Whose Land Is It Anyway? Decolonization Handbook. And there's a really great collection of essays called Survivors Speak. And of course, the 4 Seasons of Reconciliation course that I mentioned earlier is brilliant. The empowerment part of the 3 E's is twofold. We want to empower our build teammates to go out from the build and spread the word about what they've seen and done. But we also want to empower our First Nations brethren to live their best lives. And addressing housing on First Nations territory plays a really big part in that, especially for the children that will grow up in those houses. As I said before, much of their housing is more like that of a third world nation, which is simply unacceptable in this great country. And finally, the experience part seems self-evident, but bears some clarifying. Obviously, working alongside First Nations people on these builds is eye-opening, but it's also a hugely important part of putting reconciliation into action. It's an experience I can't recommend strongly enough. Now, there's a reality to this whenever you head off. I'm talking particularly about going off to a First Nations build, but it's really the same thing when you head overseas as well, in a way. There's a very real danger of considering ourselves to be the white saviors going off to help the poor natives. But that's one of the beauties of that 3E approach. As soon as you start the education portion, you soon realize that the First Nations people here in Canada are not the poor relatives of our Canadian family. That's our white colonial attitude in play. Educating ourselves means recognizing that at the time we settlers arrived here, there were fully formed communities and nations amounting to more than 8 million people. By some accounts, many times that number. And they had lived here on this land for thousands of years. We did not discover this land at all. And we certainly didn't bring civilization to the poor natives. Instead, what we gifted to them was broken treaties, reservations, residential schools, diseases like smallpox and measles, pollution, and so on. We could have, and we should have, learned so much from them about living in balance with the land instead of trying to conquer it. But that was surely not the colonial approach. As soon as you take the blinders off and realize how far off the rails we took the relationship with our First Nations peoples, you see the need for the experience and empowerment parts of the reconciliation story to help balance the scales. I really like this quote from Abel Bosom, one-time Grand Chief of the Cree Nation. He put it this way, he said, "For me, reconciliation is about resetting the button. For me, it's about looking at the past, acknowledging that we made mistakes in the past in all the different sectors, and resetting that button and starting to work together." There's great wisdom in that. So that, in a nutshell, is how I came to be committed to continuing to do habitat builds on First Nations territories in Canada. I think we all recognize the value that Habitat for Humanity brings to our communities. And I urge everybody to chip in your own communities as well. But there's something special about traveling to a First Nations community to help the efforts there. It's about putting reconciliation into action, and a lot of the things I've already talked about. But I also feel like doing it some distance away adds a little extra time and effort to go there, and that adds an extra layer of significance to the experience. And if you can join a multi-day build, there's more opportunities for sharing stories and experiences, and that adds to the impact of the impact on the participants and the community where you're building. A good friend who's an experienced Habitat team leader taught me to create opportunities for sharing and growth, so that's an important part of the planning process. So if any of that catches your interest and you want to discuss it further, I'm more than happy to do that. And if you want to join one of my teams sometime, I'm more than happy to talk to you about that too. I promise you won't regret that. I'm building a large team to head up to in the days before Indigenous Peoples Day in June of 2024. And I gladly consider anybody who wants to join our team and come along. So thank you for taking the time to listen. If anybody has any questions, send them to me, niagaraonlineworship@gmail.com. And I'll do my best to answer the questions and get back to you. So thank you again for taking the time to listen to this, and I hope to see you on a build site one day. Thanks.